They left her on his fence line under a dirty white sheet, tied up and waiting for the man who supposedly bought her. She looked him dead in the eye, broken and bruised, and whispered, "You paid for me. Now do it." But she didn't know she had just been delivered to the only man in the territory who wasn't buying, and the only man dangerous enough to send the receipt back with a vengeance. If you're still here, you're officially part of the story now. Subscribe and tell me which country you're watching from. The next twists are unbelievable. The first thing Ben Carter saw under that heavy white blanket was a bare wrist, raw and red from a rope that had been tied too tight for too long. The pulse underneath that skin was faint, fighting a losing battle against the heat, keeping a rhythm even when the rest of her body looked like it had already given up on the world. It was the kind of summer heat that sat heavy on the chest, the air thick and still outside the ranch, making the morning feel exhausted before the sun had even fully cleared the horizon. Ben was 48 years old, a man who had spent the last decade making his world as small as possible on purpose. He lived far enough from the town limits that trouble usually got tired and turned around before it ever reached his fence line. But that morning, trouble didn't ride in on a horse with a gun. It arrived silently on a wagon that shouldn't have been there. The wagon sat crooked near the north line of his property, one wooden wheel half sunk in the soft dust like it had been abandoned in a hurry. There was no driver on the bench, no fresh boot prints leading away in the dirt, just an old mule tied to the fence post, chewing slowly like it had been waiting there all night for someone to come out. The canvas cover of the wagon was gone, stripped away and replaced by that stark white blanket pulled tight over the bed. It was the way a man covered something he didn't want the sun to touch, or something he didn't want to look at. Ben stood there on his porch, his coffee cup cooling in his hand, just staring at that white shape and listening for one honest sound in the silence. There was no bird singing, no wind moving the brush, no noise from the town miles away, just the faint creak of leather on the mule and a sound beneath the blanket that was too shallow to really be called breathing. He walked out to the fence, his boots crunching in the dirt. Tucked into the knot of the rope on the tailgate was a folded piece of paper. The paper was cheap, the kind used for quick receipts, but the ink was bold and dark. 2 words were scrawled across it, written like somebody wanted them to burn straight into his eyes. Paid. Delivered. There was no name on it, no destination listed, no signature that mattered, just a smudge of a seal from a shipping clerk and a stain along the edge that looked unsettlingly like sweat. Ben's jaw tightened until it hurt. He hadn't ordered anything. He hadn't asked for help, and he certainly hadn't paid a soul in that town for a single favor. Not since the day he buried his wife and decided that the world could keep its hands off his life for good. He reached out and pulled the blanket back. A young woman lay in the wagon bed, curled up tight, like she had tried to fold herself into nothingness to disappear. Her hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and her lips were dry and cracked from dehydration. Her cheeks were bruised, dark marks sitting in the soft places where a violent hand could fit perfectly. But it was her wrists that made Ben's stomach turn. They were tied, not with care or for safety, but with the kind of harsh, complicated knots that said, "You are not a person. You are cargo." As the sunlight hit her face, her eyes fluttered open. She stared up at Ben, but there was no hope in her look. She looked at him like she had already met death and decided he was just another form of it. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just looked at him with a terrifying acceptance and whispered, "You paid for me. Now do it." Ben didn't blink. He didn't flinch at the words. He didn't ask her what she meant because, looking at the ropes and the note, he understood enough. In her mind, he was the buyer, the last stop on a terrible journey, the man who now owned whatever was left of her life. He leaned in closer, his voice coming out low and controlled, almost too quiet to hear. "I didn't buy you, and I don't take what ain't freely given." He expected relief, but her eyes didn't soften. They hardened. That was worse. That meant she thought there was no plan, no rules, no deal to follow anymore. It meant she was staring into an empty space where mercy should have been. "Then don't send me back," she whispered, her chin trembling just once before she forced it still. "Do something," Ben told himself. He pulled a small blade from his pocket and cut the rope, careful not to nick her skin. When the knots fell away, her hands didn't reach for him or for help. They stayed close to her chest, guarding the little bit of herself she still trusted. He lifted her anyway, ignoring her stiffness, and carried her inside the cabin like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Inside the cabin, he set her down in the back room and left a cup of water within her reach. Then he stepped back, giving her the space she needed to remember how to breathe. The girl watched him, her eyes measuring the distance between them like it was a weapon. Ben walked back outside to the wagon. He studied it the way a rancher studies storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He crouched by the wheels, and his stomach tightened again. The tracks were wrong. They were too clean, too shallow, like the wagon had been pushed into place by hand. It hadn't been driven in fast. It had been staged like somebody wanted it found but didn't want their own trail left behind. On the tailgate, beneath where the blanket had been, there was something else, a faint mark in the wood, pressed hard enough to leave a permanent impression. It wasn't a brand, and it wasn't a name, but it was a symbol, simple and deliberate. It was the kind of mark a man uses when he thinks he is so powerful that no one will dare question him. Ben's hand hovered over it. His fingers shook once, just once, in a way they hadn't shaken in years because he had seen that symbol before. The last time he saw it, he was standing beside a fresh grave, listening to a preacher talk about heaven while the desert swallowed the only thing he had ever loved. Ben spent the next hour in the kitchen, his movements mechanical and hollow. He stoked the fire in the iron stove, the wood popping and hissing as it caught, but he didn't feel the warmth. His mind was miles away, or perhaps years away, trapped in a memory of a time when he thought he could protect what was his. He boiled a pot of thin broth, the steam rising to dampen his weathered face. Every few minutes, he would pause, head tilted toward the back room, listening for any sound of movement, a sob, or even the rustle of sheets. There was nothing. The silence coming from that room was heavier than any noise he'd ever heard. It was the silence of someone who had learned that making noise only brought more pain. When the broth was ready, he poured it into a ceramic bowl, the spoon clinking softly against the rim, a sound that felt like a gunshot in the quiet house. He walked to the door of the guest room and hesitated. His hand hovered over the latch. He was a man who worked with cattle and horses, creatures that understood strength and command, but he had no idea how to talk to a person who had been treated like a piece of mail. He pushed the door open slowly. She hadn't moved. She was still lying on her side, her eyes fixed on a knot in the pine wood wall. She looked smaller now that she was out of the wagon, lost in the oversized quilt he had thrown over her. "You need to eat something," Ben said, his voice sounding gravelly and strange to his own ears. He didn't come too close. He set the bowl on a small wooden crate near the foot of the bed. He watched her eyes shift, tracking him like a cornered animal. "It's just broth. It'll help your stomach before you try anything heavier." She didn't reach for it. Instead, she sat up with a slow, agonizing effort, her muscles stiff from being bound. As the quilt slid down, Ben saw the purple-yellow bruising around her throat, fingerprints. The sight of it sent a cold, sharp spike of rage through him, but he kept his expression flat. He couldn't let her see his anger. She'd think it was for her. "What's your name?" he asked, trying to soften his tone. She looked at the bowl, then back at him. "Eliza," she whispered. The name sounded like it didn't belong to her anymore, like an old garment she hadn't worn in years. "They told me you were a man who didn't like to be cheated. They said if I didn't do exactly what you wanted, you'd make sure I regretted being born." Ben felt a sick twist in his gut. Whoever had dropped her off hadn't just stolen her freedom. They had poisoned his name to keep her submissive. "People say a lot of things in town to make themselves feel tall," Ben replied, pulling a chair over and sitting down, keeping a respectful distance. "The truth is, Eliza, I'm just a man who wants to be left alone. I didn't pay a dime for you. Someone is playing a game, and they use you to throw the first stone." Eliza let out a dry, shaky breath that might have been a laugh if she had the strength. "A game? I was in a cellar for 3 weeks, Mr. Carter. I wasn't a game to them. I was an inventory number." She finally reached for the bowl, her hands trembling so much that the broth splashed over the side. Ben instinctively moved to help, But the moment he leaned forward, she flinched so hard she hit the headboard. She didn't scream, but her eyes went wide with a primal terror that stopped Ben in his tracks. "I'm not going to touch you," he said firmly, holding his hands up where she could see them. "In this house, nobody touches you unless you say so. You understand me? You're not a prisoner here. The door isn't locked. As soon as you're strong enough to walk to the porch, you can leave. But until then, you're a guest." Eliza stared at him, searching his face for the lie she was sure was there. She had spent a lifetime learning that men always wanted something, and if they said they didn't, it just meant the price was hidden. She took a sip of the broth, the warmth bringing a tiny bit of color back to her ghostly skin. "Why?" she asked. "Why help me if you didn't buy me? Why not just drive the wagon back to the marshal?" Ben looked out the window toward the north line, where the sun was beginning to bake the earth. "Because the marshal is likely the one who signed that delivered note," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And because I know what it's like to have the world take everything from you while the people who are supposed to help just watch and smile." He stood up to leave, but stopped at the door. "There's a tub in the kitchen. I'll heat some more water. There's clean clothes in the trunk at the end of the bed. They belong to my wife. They'll be big on you, but they're clean." He didn't wait for a thank you, because he knew she wasn't ready to give one. He stepped out and shut the door gently. As he walked back to the kitchen, he caught his reflection in the darkened glass of a picture frame. He looked older, more tired, but for the first time in 10 years, he felt a spark of something other than grief. It was a cold, hard purpose. Someone had brought a victim to his door to mock his solitude, and they had used his late wife's memory as a backdrop for their cruelty. They thought he was a broken man who would just accept a gift and keep his mouth shut. They were wrong. The steam from the kitchen filled the small house, blurring the sharp edges of the furniture and softening the harsh reality of the morning. Ben stood by the stove, his large, calloused hands moving with a gentleness that would have surprised anyone who knew his reputation. He filled a wooden tub with warm water, testing the temperature with his elbow the way he'd seen his wife, Sarah, do 1,000 times. Every splash of water felt like a heavy heartbeat in the quiet room. He could hear Eliza moving in the back, the floorboards groaning under her light weight. It was a hesitant sound, the sound of someone who expected the floor to give way beneath them at any moment. He left the water and a bar of soap on the kitchen table and stepped out onto the porch, giving her the privacy he knew she'd trade her soul for right now. The sun was higher now, baking the wood of the porch until it smelled of old pine and resin. Ben sat on the top step, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife, but his eyes were fixed on that wagon. It was a ghost sitting in his yard. He thought about the men in town, the ones who sat in the back of the saloon, trading lies like they were playing cards. He thought about the shipping clerk with the ink-stained fingers and the marshal with the smile that never reached his eyes. They had sent her here as a joke or a test, thinking Ben's loneliness had turned into a hunger they could feed. "I'm finished," a voice said from the doorway. Ben didn't turn around immediately. He gave her a moment to stand there, to feel the air on her skin without being watched. When he finally looked, he felt a lump form in his throat. Eliza was wearing one of Sarah's old calico dresses. It was blue with small white flowers, faded from years of washing, but still bright. It was far too big for her. The shoulders hung low, and she had to bunch the waist up with a piece of scrap rope. But for the first time, she looked like a person instead of package. Her hair was damp and pulled back, revealing the sharp, elegant lines of a face that had seen far too much no and not enough yes. You look like a guest now," Ben said, his voice cracking slightly. Eliza walked to the edge of the porch, clutching the oversized sleeves. She looked out at the vast, empty horizon of the ranch. "It's so quiet here," she whispered. "In the city, there's always someone yelling. Always a door slamming or a chain rattling. Here, the air just moves." She looked at her hands, the red marks on her wrists now clean but still angry and swollen. "Why didn't you look at me the way they did? Like you were checking the teeth on a horse you just bought?" Ben stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the porch. "Because I know what it's like to be seen as nothing more than a tool for someone else's profit. My father worked himself into a grave for a mining company that didn't even send a card to my mother. I decided a long time ago that I wouldn't be part of that cycle. He walked to the railing. You're safe here, Eliza. Not because I'm a good man. I've done things I'm not proud of, but because I'm tired of seeing the wrong people win. She looked at him, and for the first time, the wall in her eyes cracked just a little. A single tear tracked through the dust, still lingering on her cheek. They're going to come for me, she said, her voice trembling. The man who sold me. He doesn't like losing his property. He'll think you're keeping me for yourself, and he'll want his payment back. Ben reached out, almost touching her shoulder before drawing his hand back, remembering her flinch from earlier. Let them come, he said, and the coldness in his voice was sharper than any blade. They delivered you to the North Line, Eliza. That means you're on my land now. And on this land, the only law that matters is mine. He saw her shoulders drop, just an inch, as the tension began to leak out of her. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of an alliance. She wasn't just a victim anymore, and he wasn't just a hermit. They were two broken things standing in the sun, waiting for the storm they both knew was coming. Ben looked at the horizon and saw a faint cloud of dust rising in the distance. Someone was coming. The dust on the horizon didn't move like a natural breeze. It had the rhythmic, steady kick of a rider who didn't care about his horse's lungs. Ben watched it for a long time, his hand resting on the smooth wood of the porch railing. He felt a presence behind him and turned to see Eliza. She was holding a dishcloth, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric. She wasn't looking at the dust. She was looking at Ben's back, searching for any sign that he was about to fold, any flicker of hesitation that meant he was going to hand her over to save his own skin. Go inside, Eliza, Ben said softly. Get away from the windows. It's him, she whispered, her voice brittle. It's Miller. He doesn't send people to do his talking. He likes to see the look on a person's face when he takes what he wants. Ben didn't move. I don't care if it's the governor himself. Go to the kitchen. He waited until he heard the soft scuff of her boots retreating into the house before he stepped down into the dirt. He didn't reach for a gun. Instead, he walked over to the old pump and splashed some water on his face, wiping the grime of the morning away. He wanted to look like a man who was wide awake. By the time the rider pulled into the yard, Ben was standing by the hitching post, looking as unbothered as a man watching the sunset. The man on the horse was younger than Ben expected, dressed in expensive leather that hadn't seen a day of real labor. He had a face that looked like it had been carved out of cold stone, handsome in a way that felt dangerous, like a polished blade. He looked at the ranch, his eyes dismissive of the modest cabin and the aging barn, before settling on Ben. You're Carter, the man said. It wasn't a question. I'm Miller. I believe you received a delivery this morning. There was a bit of a clerical error. The paperwork went to the wrong house, but the cargo ended up in the right place. I'm here to collect. Ben leaned against the post, crossing his arms. I got a wagon and a mule. I got a note that says paid. In my world, Miller, when something is paid for and delivered, the transaction is finished. I don't know anything about a clerical error. Miller's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was a practiced, predatory expression. Let's not be difficult, Ben. You're a man who likes his peace. I respect that. But that girl is worth more than this entire patch of dirt you're standing on. She's got a debt to pay, and she hasn't finished paying it yet. Now, you can be the hero for 5 minutes and end up in a shallow hole. Or you can step aside, let me take what's mine, and I'll throw in a handful of gold for your trouble. The air between them turned electric. Ben thought about the bruises on Eliza's throat. He thought about the way she flinched when he reached for a soup bowl. The rage he had been suppressing all morning started to simmer, but he kept his voice flat, almost bored. You see, that's the thing. I don't like gold that smells like a cellar. And I don't like men who think they can mail order a human being to my fence line just to see if I've still got a backbone. Miller's hand drifted toward the holster at his hip, a slow, deliberate movement meant to intimidate. You're making a very loud mistake, old man. Maybe, Ben replied, stepping forward until he was just inches from the horse's head. He looked up at Miller, his eyes hard and unforgiving. But here's the reality you're missing. You're on my land. You're outnumbered by the ghosts of every mistake you've ever made, and I've got nothing left to lose but my soul. And I'd rather lose that than let you walk into my house. For a second, The only sound was the heavy breathing of the horse. Miller looked at the cabin, then back at Ben. He realized then that Ben wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a wall. Miller slowly pulled his hand away from his gun, but the malice in his expression deepened. "You think you saved her?" Miller sneered. "You just made her a target. I'll be back, Carter. And next time, I won't be coming to talk. I'll burn this place down with both of you inside it." He yanked his horse around, digging his spurs in so hard the animal let out a pained neigh. As he galloped away, the dust he kicked up felt like a promise of blood. Ben stood there until the sound of the hooves faded into the heat. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but his hands remained steady. He turned back toward the house and saw Eliza standing behind the screen door, her silhouette thin and trembling. He didn't say anything as he walked back onto the porch. He just nodded to her, a silent assurance that the immediate danger had passed. But as he looked at the horizon, he knew the peace of his small world was gone forever. He had chosen a side, and in this territory, choosing a side usually meant choosing a grave. The silence that followed Miller's departure was thick, like the air right before a thunderstorm breaks. Ben didn't go inside immediately. He stood in the yard, his chest tight, watching the dust settle back into the parched earth. He felt the weight of his age in his joints, a reminder that he wasn't the young man who used to seek out fights just to feel alive. Now, he just wanted a quiet porch and a sunset that didn't promise blood. He turned toward the house, and through the screen door, he saw Eliza. She hadn't moved. She looked like a ghost haunting the frame of his home, her face pale against the dark wood. When he stepped inside, the smell of the broth and the lingering scent of Sarah's old cedar chest hit him. It felt like two worlds were colliding, his past of loss and this new, dangerous present. Eliza was standing by the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. She didn't look up when he entered. "He'll come back," she said, her voice so thin it barely carried across the room. "You shouldn't have done that. You should have let him take me. Men like Miller, they don't lose. They just wait until you're sleeping." Ben walked over to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee, his hands steady despite the adrenaline still humming in his veins. "I've spent a lot of years sleeping, Eliza. Maybe it's time I woke up." He sat down at the table, gesturing for her to do the same. She hesitated, then sat on the very edge of the chair, ready to bolt. "Tell me the truth. How did your name end up on a paid slip sent to my ranch?" Eliza looked down at her wrists, the blue sleeves of the dress pushed back slightly. "My father owed money to the shipping company in town. He thought he could gamble his way out a hole, but the hole just got deeper. When he couldn't pay, Miller showed up. He said a debt is a debt, and if the gold wasn't there, something else had to be." She swallowed hard, a visible lump moving in her throat. "He knew about you. He talked about the hermit on the North Line who lost his wife and his will to fight. He thought it would be funny, a way to insult you and get rid of me at the same time. He told me you were a monster who would break whatever he didn't use." Ben felt a pang of sharp human hurt. It wasn't just about the girl, it was about how the town saw him. To them, he was a hollowed-out shell, a man so far gone that he'd accept a human being as a delivery and ask no questions. They had weaponized his grief against a total stranger. "I'm sorry," Ben said. The words felt heavy because he meant them. "I'm sorry you were the coin they used to pull my tail. I thought you were part of it," she whispered, finally looking him in the eye. The terror was still there, but beneath it was a flickering light of curiosity. "When you pulled that blanket back, I was waiting for the look that says I'm just meat. But you look like you saw a person. I haven't been looked at like a person in a very long time." Ben reached across the table, not to touch her, but to push the plate of bread closer. "Eat. You can't think on an empty stomach." He watched her take a small bite, her movements becoming less mechanical. He saw the way she savored the taste, a simple piece of bread treated like a luxury. It made him realize how much he had taken for granted in his solitude. The simple dignity of a meal, a roof, and a door that stayed shut. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now, we get ready," Ben replied. He looked around his home. It was filled with memories of Sarah, the lace curtains she'd sewn, the clock that ticked with a steady, comforting rhythm. He realized he wasn't just protecting Eliza. He was protecting the last place on earth where he felt like a decent man. Miller thinks I'm an old dog with no teeth. He's going to bring people. He's going to try to scare us out. But he doesn't realize that when you have nothing left to lose, you become the most dangerous thing in the valley. Eliza looked at him, and for the first time, she reached out. Her hand, still marked by the rope, touched the sleeve of his shirt. It was a fleeting, light touch, but it felt more significant than any oath. "I'm not going to run," she said, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp edge. "I've spent my whole life running from men like him. If I'm going to die, I'd rather do it standing on a porch than hiding in a cellar." Ben nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. He saw the fire in her now, the same fire that had kept her pulse moving under that white blanket when her body wanted to quit. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a woman reclaiming her soul, and he was a man rediscovering his purpose. They sat there in the quiet kitchen, two strangers bound by a cruel joke that was about to turn into a very real war. The afternoon sun began to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. Ben knew Miller wouldn't wait for nightfall. Men like him preferred to do their damage while the sun could witness their power. He spent the next hour moving through the house with a quiet, deliberate focus. He pulled a heavy trunk away from the wall to reveal a hidden compartment in the floorboards. From it, he retrieved an old Winchester and a leather belt of ammunition. He didn't handle them with excitement or pride. He handled them like tools he had hoped he'd never have to sharpen again. Eliza watched him from the kitchen doorway. She had cleaned the table and folded the cloth, small acts of normalcy that seemed to ground her. "You move like someone who's done this before," she said softly. Her voice lacked the tremor from earlier. In its place was a flat, hollow resonance. Ben looked up, wiping a layer of dust from the rifle's barrel. "A long time ago, I wore a badge in a town not too different from this one. I thought I could change things by following the rules. I found out the hard way that the rules are often written by the people holding the whip. After I lost Sarah, I realized the only way to win was to stop playing their game entirely." He stood up, the rifle clicking as he checked the chamber. "But today the game came to me. I want to help," Eliza said, stepping into the room. She wasn't asking. She was stating a fact. "I won't hide in a cellar again. If I'm going to be the reason this house falls, then I'm going to be the reason it stays standing too." Ben looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the bruises, yes, but he also saw the iron in her spine. He handed her a small, sturdy revolver he kept in a drawer. It was heavy in her hand, but she didn't flinch. "I'll show you how to use it. But listen to me, Eliza. This isn't about being a hero. This is about survival. If they get close, you don't wait for a sign. You protect yourself." They spent the next hour in the fading light behind the barn. Ben showed her how to steady her breathing and how to squeeze the trigger without jerking the barrel. He spoke to her not as a master to a servant, but as a partner. He explained the mechanics of the weapon with a patient human touch, understanding that for her, this wasn't just a gun. It was the first time she had ever held her own agency in her hands. As the sky turned a bruised purple, the sound of multiple horses broke the silence. It wasn't the rhythmic trot of a lone rider. It was the heavy, disorganized thumping of a group. Ben felt a cold stillness settle over him. He led Eliza back to the house, making sure she was positioned near the heavy oak cabinets in the kitchen where the walls were thickest. "Stay low," he whispered, his hand lingering on hers for a second longer than necessary. "Whatever happens, don't come out until I tell you." He stepped out onto the porch just as 4 riders pulled into the yard, forming a semicircle around the house. Miller was at the center, flanked by 3 men who looked like they'd been pulled from the darkest corners of saloon. They carried torches, the flames licking at the air, casting flickering, demonic light across their faces. The marshal was there, too, sitting slightly back from the rest, his silver badge glinting mockingly in the firelight. "Last chance, Carter," Miller yelled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Bring her out now, and maybe I'll leave you enough of this shack to sleep in tonight. Refuse, and I'll make sure the only thing left of this ranch is the smell of ash." Ben stood his ground, the Winchester held casually across his chest. He looked at the marshal. "You're a long way from your office, Jim. Does the law in this territory usually include arson and kidnapping?" The marshal spat into the dirt. The law says she's property, Ben. Unclaimed property that belongs to the man who holds the debt. You're the one breaking the peace. Then the law is a lie, Ben replied, his voice calm and steady. And I don't negotiate with liars. Miller didn't wait for another word. He flicked his wrist, and a torch sailed through the air, landing on the dry hay near the barn. The flames took hold instantly, a bright, angry orange beginning to eat into the wood. Burn it down, Miller screamed. The world exploded into motion. Ben raised his rifle, but he didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the ground in front of the horses, the dust kicking up and causing the animals to rear back in a panic. He wanted to buy time, to force them into a mistake. But as a second torch hit the porch roof above his head, he realized that Miller wasn't interested in a fight. He wanted an execution. Inside, he heard the back door of the kitchen creak open. He turned, expecting to see Eliza fleeing into the brush, but instead he saw her standing on the threshold, the revolver gripped in both hands. She wasn't looking at the fire or the horses. She was looking straight at Miller, her face a mask of cold, focused fury. In that moment, she wasn't the girl from the wagon. She was the storm that Miller had been foolish enough to summon. The heat from the burning barn was a physical weight, pushing against Ben's skin, but the coldness in Eliza's eyes was sharper. Miller saw her on the porch and let out a jagged, ugly laugh that cut through the roar of the flames. "There she is," he shouted, pointing a gloved finger. The little bird finally grew some claws. "Put that toy down, Eliza, before you hurt yourself and make me raise the price of your skin." Eliza didn't lower the gun. She stepped out into the flickering orange light of the porch, the fire reflecting in her dark pupils. "The price is already paid, Miller," she said, her voice steady and hauntingly calm. "But not by Ben. It was paid by every minute I spent in that cellar. It was paid by every bruise you left. Today, the account is closed." One of the riders, a man with a jagged scar across his nose, spurred his horse forward, thinking he could intimidate her with sheer bulk. He didn't expect the crack of the revolver. The bullet didn't hit him. She aimed for the dirt right between the horse's hooves, but the animal panicked, throwing the rider into the dust. The sudden chaos broke the standoff. Ben didn't waste a second. He fired a shot into the air, a deafening roar that sent the other horses scattering. "Enough!" Ben roared over the sound of the crackling wood. "Marshal, look at her. Look at what you're defending. You took an oath to protect people, not to be a debt collector for a monster. If you let this happen, you're not just a bad lawman. You're nothing." The marshal looked at Eliza, then at the burning barn, and finally at Miller. For a heartbeat, the man's face flickered with a remnant of human shame. But Miller wasn't interested in a moral awakening. He pulled his own pistol and aimed it straight at Ben's chest. "I'm done talking to ghosts and cowards," Miller hissed. Everything seemed to slow down. Ben saw Miller's finger tighten on the trigger. He braced himself, knowing he wouldn't be fast enough. But before Miller could fire, a shadow moved. It was the rider Eliza had unhorsed. He had scrambled to his feet and lunged for her, trying to pull her off the porch. Eliza didn't scream. She turned, using the weight of the heavy revolver to strike the man across the face, sending him reeling back into the dirt. In that moment of distraction, the marshal finally did something human. He didn't fire his gun, but he rode his horse directly into Miller's path, blocking the shot. "That's enough, Miller," the marshal said, his voice thick with a sudden, weary disgust. "This wasn't the deal. I'm not burning a man in his home over a gambling debt. We're leaving." Miller's face contorted into something barely human. He looked like he wanted to kill them all, but he saw the way Ben's rifle was leveled at his head and the way Eliza stood, regrouped and ready, with the revolver. He was outnumbered by people who had found something to fight for. With a snarl, he yanked his horse around. "This isn't over, Carter. You can't keep her forever. The world will come for its own." "Let it come," Ben said, his voice a low growl. "I'll be right here." The riders disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the sound of the dying fire and the heavy breathing of two people who had just stared into the abyss and didn't blink. Ben dropped the rifle to his side, his shoulders finally sagging. The barn was a loss. The the wood collapsing into a heap of glowing embers, but the house was still standing. He turned to Eliza. She was still holding the gun, her knuckles white. He walked over and gently placed his hand over hers, easing the weapon down. She didn't flinch this time. Instead, she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his chest for just a second. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was the lean of a survivor finally finding a solid place to rest. "You did it," Ben whispered. "You stood your ground." Eliza looked up at him, the soot and sweat making her look like a warrior. "No," she said softly. "We did it. You gave me a place to stand. I just had to decide to stay there." They stood on the porch, watching the last of the flames flicker out. The ranch felt different now. No longer a hiding place for a grieving man, but a fortress for two people who had decided that their lives were worth more than the price others put on them. The night was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of a new beginning. The morning sun rose over the ranch, but instead of the usual heavy, stagnant heat, a fresh breeze swept through the valley, carrying away the scent of the charred wood. Ben and Eliza spent the early hours working together. There was no need for many words. They communicated through the shared task of clearing the debris. Ben watched as Eliza handled the tools with a steady focus, the blue fabric of Sarah's dress swaying as she moved. She wasn't just clearing a field. She was clearing the wreckage of her own past. Every blackened timber she tossed aside seemed to lighten the load on her shoulders. For Ben, the sight of someone else moving through his world, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a living, breathing partner, filled a void he hadn't even realized had grown so deep. Later that afternoon, they rode into town. Ben didn't go in with his rifle drawn, and Eliza didn't hide her face. They walked straight into the shipping office, the very place that had stamped her life as delivered. The clerk behind the desk, the man with the ink-stained fingers, looked up and went pale, his eyes darting toward the door as if looking for an escape. Ben didn't scream or break things. He simply placed the paid note on the counter and leaned in, his voice low and cold. "The next time you trade in lives instead of grain," Ben said, "make sure you're ready to pay the price yourself. Because I'm keeping this note. And if I ever see another wagon like that one on the North Line, I won't be coming for an explanation. I'll be coming for you." The news of the standoff at the ranch had already spread, and as they walked back to their horses, the townspeople watched from the shadows of the boardwalks. The whispers were different now. They weren't whispering about the broken hermit or the lost girl. They were looking at two people who had refused to be the punchline of a cruel joke. The marshal watched them from his porch, his badge polished but his gaze averted. He knew that the power dynamic in the valley had shifted. The law was no longer just a piece of tin. It was something that had been held accountable by a man with a backbone and a woman with a soul. Back at the ranch, as the sun began its descent, Ben stood by the porch railing. Eliza came out and stood beside him, looking at the spot where the new barn would eventually rise. She looked at the horizon, her hands no longer trembling. "I used to think that being free meant having nowhere to go," she said softly. "But I think I was wrong. I think being free means choosing where you stay." She looked at Ben, a small, genuine smile finally touching her lips. "I'm staying." Ben felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the summer sun. He realized that life isn't measured by the things we lose or the walls we build to keep the world out. It's measured by the moments we decide to stand up, even when we're tired, and the people we choose to stand up for. He had spent 10 years waiting for his life to end, only to realize that it was just waiting for a reason to begin again. They had been brought together by an act of pure evil, yet they had turned it into a foundation of human dignity. The moral of the story is that no human being is a commodity, and no debt is worth a person's soul. We are often told that the world is a cold, transactional place where the powerful buy and the weak are sold, but that is only true if we allow it to be. True strength isn't found in a holster or a ledger. It's found in the courage to see a person where others see cargo and the willingness to defend a stranger as if they were your own. When the world tries to deliver you to your breaking point, remember that you are the one who decides when the transaction is finished. Kindness isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that survives the fire.